Hi students, welcome to our next episode in our study of the book of Revelation. Today we're looking at Revelation chapter 8. I'm going to read the passage for us, and then we're going to get into looking at our notes. Revelation chapter 8, starting at verse 1, says this. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Then I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and the seven trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it down on the earth or the land. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Now the seven angels, who had the seven trumpets, prepared to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the land, or the earth. And a third of the earth or the land was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain, burning with fire, was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers, and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water, because it had been made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead, "Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the land or the earth, at the blast of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow." So turning to our passage now, we're going to start by looking at verse 1, which says, "When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour." So what does this mean? Well, the brief silence in heaven contrasts sharply with the noise of praise and song that characterize the heavenly scene in chapters 4 and 5. Conspicuously missing are the loud voices of the martyrs inquiring how long it would be before they were avenged in 6:10. Perhaps their cries have ceased because the requested vengeance upon their persecutors, the leaders of the Jews, had now commenced. Another possible allusion is to the siege of Jericho. The opening of the seventh seal here is followed by the blowing of trumpets, Revelation 8:6, which is what happened when the walls of Jericho fell. Not only so, but prior to the blowing of those trumpets, the Israelites marched around that fated city in silence. And so in both instances you have silence, trumpets, then the conquest of God's enemies. In the first case, Jericho was the enemy of God. Now, Jerusalem itself has become God's enemy. So then we get to the scene of an angel before the throne. Let me read verses 2 to 4 for us. 2 to 5 rather. The text says this: "Then I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth or the land." You remember this phrase, earth, is that Greek word gay, which can either be translated as earth or land. With fire from the altar, and threw it on the land. I prefer the word land at this point. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. So turning to our notes here then. Another angel came, and because of his functions at the altar, a priestly in nature, most commentators assume that this is a representation of Christ in another of his offices. At any rate, this angel comes and stands at the altar, carrying a golden censer. He is given much incense, which he mixes with the prayers of the saints, and presents it on the golden altar before the throne. The smoke of the incense, mixed together with the prayers of the saints, ascends up to God from the hand of the angel. And then, in an obvious answer to prayer, the angel fills up the censer with fire from the altar and casts it all down upon the earth. As a consequence, there was a dramatic impact on the earth. Voices, lightning, thunder, and an earthquake. With that preliminary judgment completed, the 7 other angels prepared themselves to sound their trumpets. So the prayers represented here are no doubt the prayers of the martyred saints who were under that same altar back at the 5th seal. They were crying out for vengeance, and were told to be patient for a little season. We saw that in 6:11. That season of waiting is apparently now complete, and it is time for their prayers to be answered. Given that the prayers being answered here are prayers from first-century martyrs, we may conclude that this battery of judgment coming from the 7 trumpets are judgments that were going to be falling on Jerusalem in the course of the Jewish War, AD 66 to 70. The point that's being made here is that in light of the context here, in light of the fact that these prayers are the prayers of first-century martyrs, the most natural way to read this text, I think, is along the preterist school of interpretation. So moving on here now to the 7 trumpets. Reading verses 6 and 7. Now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood. And these were thrown upon the earth or the land, and a third of the earth was burned up, or a third of the land was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up. All the green grass was burned up. So, a couple notes to take here. The 7 trumpets follow the same general pattern that the 7 seals did, with the first 4 divided from the final 3. In this case, the last 3 trumpets are identified as woes. With the seals, the first 4 were associated with horsemen. There is no pressing reason to take all these in a serial fashion. The description is of the apocalyptic destruction of the city of Jerusalem, and each trumpet gives us a fuller picture of what was going to happen in the one cataclysmic judgment that was going to fall upon that wretched city. The point being made here is this: as we read the opening of these 7 seals, and now moving into the blowing of 7 trumpets, we don't need to read this necessarily as a timeline of events that are all going to happen one after the other in a big long line. Rather, what we're getting here is a picture of a cataclysmic judgment that was going to fall upon Israel. So the sounding of the trumpet signals the commencement of battle. This is God's war against an apostate nation. The combination of hail and fire and blood makes us think of the judgment that God rained down upon Egypt. The language here is very similar to the language used in speaking about the judgment that came against Egypt. You can look up a number of these texts here to see that. Exodus 9:23, Psalm 18 verse 13, Psalm 78:48, and Psalm 105:32. The point to recognize here is this. This is judgment language against a nation. Sometimes people will read this and they'll hear about hail and fire mixed with blood, and immediately they're thinking of some end of the world catastrophe where for some reason it's raining blood and fire from heaven. No, this is judgment language that's used all throughout the Old Testament to talk about judgment against a nation, particularly judgment against Egypt. So the destruction of Jerusalem occurred in AD 70, but there was plenty of devastation to Judea in the years running up to that fateful year. Israel, once gloriously delivered from Egypt, had herself become Egypt. So in the same way, in the lead up to the destruction of Pharaoh and his army, there was much judgment being brought against Egypt. Likewise, in the years leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, there was much judgment being brought against Israel. And I think that much of this is what's being talked about here. Judgment that comes against Israel before the final destruction that happens in AD 70. I think that's what's going on in the language that we see in the next few trumpets. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain, burning with fire, was thrown into the sea. And a third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Now again, when many people read this passage, they think of some end of the world event. At the end of the world, a third of the sea creatures are going to die. You often see articles on Facebook about how fish are dying from pollution. This is what was talked about in the book of Revelation. This sort of thing. But I think as we examine the text more carefully, this isn't what's being discussed here. So let's turn to our notes then and think about what is going on here. This trumpet can be applied to the destruction of Israel and Jerusalem in the Jewish War of AD 66 to 70, in both a symbolic and literal sense. Symbolically, the image of a mountain in prophecy often refers to a government or kingdom. And what I want to do here is I want us to actually look up some of these verses and think about what they have to say, because in these verses we see very clearly that this language of a mountain is often used to talk about a nation or a kingdom, or a government or a kingdom. The first passage is Psalm 46 verse 2, which says this: "Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There is a river whose stream make glad the city of God, the holy inhabitants of the Most High." Now, if you read the whole Psalm 46, you'll see that the language of mountains is in reference to kingdoms or governments. And what we're seeing here is when it says, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, verse 1 says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Even when mountains are moved into the heart of the sea, even when kingdoms are overthrown, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help. That's what's being talked about there. So first thing we see from the Old Testament is the language of mountains being thrown into the sea is a picture of governments or kingdoms being overthrown. In those situations, God is our present refuge and help. The next passage to look at is Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, which says, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." What do we notice here? The mountain of the Lord shall be the highest of all the mountains. Is this saying that there's going to be a literal mountain that belongs to the Lord that's going to be higher? No, it's talking about the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God will be the biggest kingdom, and all the other kingdoms of the earth will stream up to God's kingdom. So, two things we see now. Mountains being thrown into the sea is a representation for governments or kingdoms being overthrown. Mountains are representative of nations and kingdoms, God's kingdom being the largest of them. The next verse for us to look at is from Zechariah chapter 4 and verse 7. That text says this: Who are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you shall become a plain, and he shall bring forward the top stone amid shouts of grace, grace to it. What's going on here? A mountain being leveled is a proclamation of judgment against this nation. A mountain being leveled is a proclamation of judgment against this nation. The last one for us to look at is Jeremiah chapter 51 and verse 25, which says this. One moment. Verse 25 says this: Behold, I am against you, O destroying mountain, declares the Lord, which destroys the whole earth. I will stretch out my hand against you, and roll you down from the crags, and make you a burnt mountain. In this last passage, we see that a burning mountain is another proclamation of God's judgment against a kingdom. So let's take these things together then as we consider this blowing of the second trumpet. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain, burning with fire, was thrown into the sea. This language then, I think the most natural way to understand this, the great mountain on fire being thrown into the sea, is God saying judgment is about to come against this kingdom. Judgment is about to come against this kingdom. Then we have the language of a third of the sea became blood, a third of the living creatures, a third of the ships. The third language, I think, is symbolic of partial judgment. This isn't the final AD 70 judgment, but this is in the build-up to the AD 70 judgment. The nation of Israel, their government, their leadership is going to be overthrown. It's going to be slowly torn down. And then only at the end of the Jewish war will the final judgment come. In light of this Old Testament context, we can see that the mountain that would be destroyed is in fact a representation of Israel. See also Matthew 21 verses 18 to 22. We're not going to read it here, but I'd strongly recommend looking up this passage. In that passage you see God declaring judgment against the fig tree, which was representative of Israel. Then in the next verse he says, if you have faith like that of a mustard seed, you will tell a mountain to be cast into the sea, and it will. I take it that in light of that, what we're seeing is that by faith, the apostles declared judgment against Israel, and by faith that mountain was cast into the sea. The sea probably represents the Gentile nations, as it does throughout Scripture, and the image of a mountain city being thrown into the sea is an image of judgment, and it is not meant to be taken literally, as though Mount Zion was destined to go whistling overhead. And in the same way, the sea is symbolic of the Gentile world into which the Jews who survived the war would be dispersed. The third trumpet then, the third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers, and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. So when Moses brought the children of Israel away from the Red Sea, in Exodus 15:22, they came to a place called Marah. It was called that because the water was bitter. The Lord showed Moses a tree there, which he threw into the bitter water in order to make it sweet. Verses 23 to 25. In this passage, the reversal is plainly shown. The waters are sweet, and God throws a great star burning like a torch, reminiscent of the tree in Exodus, into the water in such a way as to make them bitter. Now, why is this significant? Because wormwood means bitter, and because of the warning that was given to them at Marah. With Egypt of recent memory still smoldering, we read these words: If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commands, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. If they kept his commandments, they would not be visited with the diseases that had afflicted the Egyptians. They would not take the place of Egypt, but unfortunately they did not keep God's commandments, and now he was making Marah bitter again. So keep in mind once again that this judgment is aimed straight at Israel. The fourth trumpet then. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. So the fourth trumpet is blown, and the visitation comes upon the sun, moon, and stars. The judgment is partial, not total, but it is nonetheless striking. The question raised by the image is this: is the sun, for example, partially eclipsed, with a third of it covered? Or is it the light from the entire sun diminished by a third, as could happen with thick air pollution? I take this as symbolic, not literal, but the nature of the picture affects the understanding of what is being pictured. I take this as an indication of political upheaval in and around the time of the Jewish war, during which the Roman emperors Nero, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius all died, and not peacefully in bed either. One after another killed his predecessor, and yet Rome continued. So throughout the Old Testament, the language of a collapsing or failing solar system is the language that indicates judgment upon a nation or a city. Consider the following. A bunch of these we've already looked at, but you might benefit from reminding yourselves of those passages, especially if you're struggling to see how this is talking about temporal judgment against a nation. The sun, moon, and stars are representations of earthly rulers, and what is happening to them in the heavenly vision is what is actually going to happen to their counterparts on earth. In this case, the indication is of partial judgment. Now, there's one other note to make here about this. I think it's very interesting that in this fourth trumpet, you have the sun, moon, and stars. Now, if you think back to the Old Testament, you might ask yourself, where else do we see the sun, moon, and stars being representative of something important? The key passage that I think is, of course, the story of Joseph. You'll remember he had his dream early on of the sun, moon, and stars representing his father, his mother, and his brothers. Or in other words, the sun, moon, and stars representing Israel, representing God's people. So I think there's definitely allusions to that here as well. The falling of the sun, moon, and stars, or the diminishing of the sun, moon, and stars, is the diminishing of Israel. What's coming next is frightful, and we're going to see that in our next chapter study. Because in verse 13 we read this: Then I looked and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead. Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, at the blasts of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow. So what do these next three angels have in store for the people of Israel? Well, you're going to have to wait till our next session to find that out. Thanks for listening today, guys. Hopefully it was helpful for your studies, and I'll see you next time. God bless.